This is Audiovisual Cultures, the podcast that explores different areas of the arts and media. Join me, your host Paula Blair, and the researchers, practitioners and enthusiasts I meet along the way. See our website at audiovisualcultures.wordpress.com and other links in the show notes for more information. For now, enjoy the show. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Audiovisual Cultures. Today, we're looking at the relationship between art and well-being with my very special guest, Dr. Rabya Mughal, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in science, arts and culture at University College London's School of Life and Medical Sciences. You are most welcome, Rabya. It's a real pleasure to have you join us on the podcast today. How are you doing?
Hi, Paula. Thank you very much for inviting me and for that introduction. That was lovely. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It's been a real treat getting to know you just a little bit this past few months and to learn about your research. So I'm really looking forward to getting into all of that today. We're going to be talking about the role of creativity and what that can play in our health. But there are some issues, of course, because it takes a certain level of privilege to have the means to be creative and do creative things. So as I understand, you've been working on a lot of these sorts of areas and issues, specifically on the UCL Community COVID project. Would you be happy to just outline that project a bit for us?
Yeah, so UCL Community COVID project is being conducted at the UCL Culture and Health Research Group at the Division of Biosciences. And what we do is we look at how non-medical interventions can help with certain health conditions, and we focus on arts and creativity. So what we do know is that things like art, creativity, things even like sewing and embroidery, being in nature, listening to music, socializing with people, reading philosophy, what we call salutogenic approaches, so non-medical holistic approaches, we know that these can be beneficial for our health. What we do is look at how we can try to evidence that benefit. And the Community COVID part of this research is looking at how creativity, arts, and other forms of community engagement have been used during the pandemic. And in particular, what we look at is how this community engagement can be used to address social and health inequity.
Fantastic. While many people might have access to something, they might be able to find something around the place. You could, if you have a pen, or you could draw on the back of an envelope or write something down, or most of us have phones of some description you can make notes on or take a photograph with or something. But it's not always as simple, is it, as just plucking creativity out of the air. It's knowing what to do, what you're able to do. There's a whole raft of things going on there. And there may also be different social, cultural, maybe educational and economic barriers, as you say, that prevent somebody from just giving something a try. I mean, even psychologically, people might think, oh, I'm not good enough, or that's stupid, only kids do that sort of thing, all sorts of reasons. And that's all before we add this weight of COVID on top of everything and the added pressures that's introduced. Would you be happy to explain and just tease out some of those details, those issues for us, just so we have a very full picture of what's going on there?
Yes, I think it's a really interesting question, but it's also a really big question as well, isn't it? Because what we know, what the evidence says, is that when we do these arts and creativity activities, we can involve ourselves in things like aesthetic engagement. We might be using our imagination. We might be utilizing our emotions. There's cognitive stimulation that goes on. There's sensory stimulation. There's social interaction. We might be using physical activity. And in turn, those things have a positive psychological response. For example, it might help us with coping and emotional strategies. It might have a positive physiological response, such as it might lower our stress levels or lower stress hormone responses. It might help us with social outcomes. For example, it might reduce loneliness or isolation, and it might help us with behavioural outcomes such as adopting healthier behaviours and skills and developing skills. So what we know that the evidence says that these holistic approaches, these creative and artistic approaches are beneficial to our physical health, and there's a lot of evidence for that. The evidence is there to say that this works, but then we come across, like you say, these barriers for people. And I think that's really interesting to break down those barriers. So what we see is a lot of cultural, socioeconomic, and physical barriers to arts participation. And breaking that down even further is when we frame these things, when we make these research questions, are we making the research question? Are we putting our own frame of mind into the research question? And I say that because a lot of the research that I've read indicates that we are doing this. One of the pieces of research that I'm thinking about is it came out quite recently, and it was about arts and music participation in various different social groups. And one of the music participation things that they were talking about was participation in ballet. That was just one of the things. There were lots of other things, but they were looking at participation in ballet. And then at the same time, you're looking at different socioeconomic groups, how they're participating in ballet. So then when you look at this activity and then you measure its participation in different groups, it wasn't a surprise that there weren't a lot of South Asian communities participating in ballet. But then that's not to say that South Asian communities and people from those groups don't participate in any musical activity, that they don't engage in music, or they don't use music as different things, as prayer or meditation, or using different types of music, or using different ways of expressing music. So that's just to do with music, right? What I'm trying to say is that when you frame the question in a certain way, you're going to get certain types of answers. So I think that's also got something to do with it. So when we say that there's low participation in cultural activities from certain socioeconomic groups, we're also saying that there's low participation in our interpretation of what cultural participation really means. So yeah, I think that might be more of a reflection on the research question itself. But then also, when we go to implement community activities and music and arts within the bureaucratic structures that we have. So, for example, when we take the NHS and we have this idea that we should implement holistic strategies to help with long-term health conditions, when we then take that same research culture into implementing this kind of stuff within the institutions that we have, are we then saying, okay, well, we think that all diabetic people should go and watch the ballet? These are the mismatches that we might have. So I think that's one part of it, is how we interpret cultural activity. So when we say that, then yes, there are lots and lots of barriers, but there are generally lots of barriers as well. There is truth to the fact that there are barriers to arts participation. For example, when we talked to, as part of the project, we've talked to a lot of social workers, we've talked to a lot of link workers. I'm not too sure if you know, if you've heard of link workers, so people that work in social prescribing within the NHS, so that work within this kind of holistic system that's in the NHS. When we speak to them, the sentiment is generally that when they're working with people with vulnerabilities, when they're working with people who have socioeconomic vulnerabilities, for example, people who are using food banks, people who are single mums, people on low incomes, when you're working with them and bringing to them holistic approaches to their health, for example, saying, well, why don't you go on a nature walk? Why don't you do a collage workshop, for example? Their answers generally are, we've got more pressing issues. We've got housing forms to fill in. We've got this problem. I've got this problem with my council tax. I've got this problem with universal credit, or I've got this problem with childcare. And so these things are much, much more pressing, or appear to be much, much more pressing than taking part in a nature walk. And so there's that kind of mismatch as well. So we might call it a barrier to participation, but it might also be that participation just doesn't seem like it's very important to a lot of people. So I guess you have to look at it from a top-down and a bottom-up perspective. So what do we say is participation, and what do we say are the barriers to participation, and what are participants, what are people within the service saying are their barriers to participation, are their priorities for participation? Yeah, it's a big question. It's a very big question. What are the barriers to participation? And I guess it's quite a philosophical question as well, because you're bringing to it lots of your own thinking.
I wonder if it's part of a general landscape of thinking that the arts in general are just frivolous. They're superficial, they're not important. And that's why they're the first to get defunded and that sort of stuff. It's probably part of a much bigger problem.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the system, and I don't know whether this is just endemic to this country, or whether it's, we have a civil service. The UK is famous for its civil service, and whether that kind of thinking is endemic to the civil service and the bureaucracy, I'm not too sure. But yeah, there is this way of working where if it's preventative, then it doesn't get as much funding, and it doesn't get as much attention as when there's a crisis. So when you get to a point where you do need immediate medical intervention, that's when our medical services do very, very well. But it's the point of prevention. It's the point of adopting healthy behaviours. It's the point of looking after your health up until the point where it doesn't become a crisis. And these things are the bulk of, the money that goes into the NHS are to do with these long-term conditions. I guess when you're looking at preventative, it's different from when you're actually in the crisis. And so when something falls into that preventative category, because it's not immediate, because it's not of your immediate concern, it's not there at all. And maybe these are behaviours that we need to adopt, or behaviours that we need to promote. But we do know that arts intervention work. So what can we do about those two bits of information?
Really fascinating stuff. Yeah, just to go off track a little bit here, there is a really amazing charity here in Newcastle upon Tyne, which annoyingly their name is escaping me, but they have been on the podcast before. I think it's Rooms for You, that's what it is. And they specialise in doing arts projects with people with terminal illness. So they're in their end of life, and they may have a few months, a few weeks, maybe 6 months, something like that. And they do lots of arts projects with them, and it just makes them happy, and it keeps people occupied, and they feel more positive, and they are able to think better about how to spend their last time. And I suppose it's part of that idea of when you can't prevent anything, what can you do to have people have actually a good end of their life as well? So there's so many, I think, angles to where this could be important, and it's not at all frivolous. It's actually really essential for well-being at all stages of life. So there's an awful lot there to think about. And I think there's probably really strong links with mental health, because again, it gets to a crisis point before anything really happens a lot of the time. Sometimes people never get the help they need, and it can end in very, very awful circumstances. It's that sort of thing. I think there were a lot of epidemiologists and virologists out there a year ago saying, like, if we overreact and we prevent stuff, that's better than having to deal with a crisis. And of course, most of the world has had to deal with an absolute crisis and is dealing with an absolute crisis at the moment. So yes, there's a lot to be said, I think, for putting more into preventative measures in these. So hopefully just by talking about this and educating people about it, that'll help. If we look then specifically at maybe how you're trying to address that with the community COVID project and the ways that you've been gathering data and learning more, understanding more about the vulnerabilities people have and the range of stories people bring with them and how we understand different equalities. If you're happy to, maybe we could talk then a bit about the workshops that you've been doing as part of that, and the idea of actually resourcing the creative activities and what can happen when you provide people with the means to do, something creative, and if there's a little bit of direction going on there too in a facilitated workshop. So if you're happy to talk us through that, that'd be great.
So some of the workshops that we've been doing with participants have been around people's experiences of lockdown, their experiences of the pandemic, their experiences maybe of accessing services or experiencing loneliness or isolation or the anxiety that's come with the pandemic, and expressing that through art forms. So we've run a couple of very, very interesting workshops. The first one was run by somebody called Ma Rana, who works with us, who is actually a PhD student who's working on interventions with people with dementia. And so she does lots of really interesting things, such as embroidery, so the mindfulness that comes with embroidery, and also the fine motor skills, and everything that comes with doing this very, very intricate and thoughtful thing for a long period of time. Her workshop was on collage, and we looked at how we might be able to express our feelings through the medium of collage. And that might involve looking at lots of old magazines and bits of paper and things that you might have lying around, and looking at maybe words in newspapers and picking them out and thinking about why you're picking them out. And so when you see somebody's collage on a piece of paper, they might have used a certain color, they might have used a certain picture, they might have used certain words to bring the picture together. So it might look like a complete mess of a picture. It might not look completely aesthetically great. It might look wonderful. That's beside the point. What the point of the collage is to look at it and think, how does this reflect my experience? And in looking at reflecting my experience, how do I then talk about my experience? How do I frame my experience? And if I can have a sort of narrative around the experience, then maybe I might be able to address the issues that come up during the experience. For example, my collage in particular, and I thought this was very, very interesting when I was thinking why I was doing this myself. My collage looked at the Meghan and Harry interview, and I picked out pictures of Meghan and Harry, and for some reason I also picked out words that weren't to do with the interview but were around understanding and telling my side of the story and family and these kinds of things, and I'm picking these things out and thinking, why have I picked these things out? Maybe I'm thinking about my own family, maybe I'm thinking about my own way that I project myself, or the way that I am talking about how I've experienced things. And when you look at these, and then you look at everybody's collages, and you ask everybody to talk about their collages, you can see some very, very, very interesting stories. You hear about people's experiences. And rather than sitting down and doing a traditional interview with somebody, which we might do in research, and it might be very, very structured, when you get somebody to express their opinion through the medium of art, through the medium of collage, you might get a lot more rich data from that. You might get a lot more interesting data from that, or you might get more of a glimpse of the person rather than a set of structured answers that they might want to tell you just to tell you. So we run these workshops just for that purpose, to understand how people have been experiencing COVID. And that's one of the things that we've been doing as part of the Community COVID project. We've also done a lot of focus groups with people. So we've spoken to link workers and social prescribers, and people that are working in the community, people that are working in arts engagement in the community, people that are working in local authorities, and social workers and teachers, to ask them about what do you think are the barriers to participation? What can we do to make these things much more accessible for people? And what do you think are the issues around what's happening in arts participation and stuff? Yeah, and as well as that, we're doing lots of traditional quantitative work, which we have to do as well.
It must be nice then to be able to participate in the workshops, as well as having to do the more traditional scientific data crunching and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I really like the idea that we can do both. I think it's very, very important to have that scientific data crunching and that quantitative data that can say, look, X, Y, Z happens, and this is the p-value, and this is this percentage of people say this, and therefore we can confidently say this exists because the statistics say so. But then when you look at the real world experiences, you can at least paint a rich picture, and those two quantitative and qualitative pieces of data, when they come together, I think together they can create something very, very coherent. And I think that's what research should look more like.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I mean, I think when maybe the general public, those of us who maybe don't know how the scientific process works necessarily, we just imagine boffins in white coats in a laboratory, that sort of thing. So it was really fun because I participated in one of the workshops, and it was really fantastic to have you in there with us. And you were just the same as all of us, because we're all being facilitated by Ma, and there were only a few of us there, but we were having a nice chat. that as well, so it was quite, in a way, it was like a talking therapy for some people, as well as the process of, I was very quiet. I get very hyper focused when I'm doing stuff like that. So I find it quite difficult to have a chat and make things. So I'm sort of making things and being really doing the stuff, but I'm listening. But it was great just to have you there with us, and it sort of breaks down that barrier as well between the researchers and the participants that you're studying. We're not just lab rats.
Yeah, and I think it's better to do research in that way. I've got to just say also, there was another workshop that we did with the artist called Alejandra, and that was a really, really good workshop as well. And she actually used things that were just lying around in the room, and you look at the things that there are, and maybe write something down on a piece of paper, and then create texture out of the paper, and then you take pictures of it with your phone or whatever. Or if you don't have a phone, then you just look at it. That was a really interesting workshop as well, where we wrote down the first thing that came to mind, and then took pictures of it, and then looked at it from a certain angle. And she's a photographer, and so she talks about perspective and everything, but then all the different types of perspective that there are. So not just literally the perspective, but also how you're framing your perspective, how you're framing your experience. And some of the photos that people sent in were really, really interesting. Some of the things that they had written down on the paper were really, really interesting, and how they'd used the paper to express their feelings, like scrunching it up or tearing it apart or folding it, gave you an insight into how their experience how the pandemic had impacted on them, and what their experience of it was.
I think being able to have a space where people felt very safe to just talk about that, and to sometimes to use what they were actively doing in the moment.
Yeah.
So it was a very live, quite a visceral experience as well, to just hear people. And people have very, very sad stories, like awful, awful things have happened to so many people. I think the numbers became so big so fast in terms of deaths and cases and that sort of thing. There are so many human stories where people have had tough times, and their survival stories, and they're barely survival stories in some cases, whether it's directly to do with COVID or not. It was really important to remember as well, like, again, yourself, you're a researcher looking at this, but you're also a human being surviving a pandemic. And that's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah.
And, billions of us are doing this together, and maybe more together than some, but it has affected everyone, so it's been really important actually to see a face of the research and see you as humans. And it's been amazing actually that so many researchers of all kinds are being so open and, exposing themselves and being quite vulnerable in doing that. But there's so many doctors out there who've set up their YouTube channels, and they're telling us what's going on all the time. And on Twitter you see these very generous, thoughtful threads from people who go, I'm an actual virologist, here we go, and explaining a bunch of stuff. I just have really appreciated your presence and the actual presence of the research and the researcher being in there. But again, the importance of remembering all of you who are doing that work, you're people, and that's so important. Just a wee reminder to check out the show notes wherever you're listening for relevant links, including audiovisualcultures.wordpress.com for more information, and to sign up to our free monthly newsletter. If you felt comfortable to do so, because you bring your lived experience as well as your research experience to the project. If you're happy to go into that in a bit more detail, or whatever you're happy to talk about there.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I think it is really important to be a person whilst you're researching. It is really, really important to understand where somebody is coming from when you're researching that person. That is what we're doing. We're looking at people's lives, we're looking at people's lived experiences. We're going very, very deep into their psyche and talking about some very, very personal things that have happened to them. And in order to understand that and empathize with that, I'm not saying that researchers that don't have lived experience aren't able to do that. Of course, we're all able to have empathy. But when you do have that lived experience, you bring a different level of empathy to the situation. And I think it is very, very important to not have this power balance between the researcher and the participant. In my mind, when we do these research projects, when we look at what's happening on the ground, and when we're looking at public services that are working with people who are facing the most inequality in society, then we have to come at it from a position of partnership. we can't be saying this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to implement it and this is how we're going to run the service for you. We shouldn't have that power dynamic. We shouldn't have that hierarchy, both within research and within the services themselves. And unfortunately, that is what we see. We see this hierarchy. We see an us versus them kind of culture. We see a dynamic where I am the professional and I'm helping you. And it really ought not to be like that. When we create services, when we design services, when we innovate these kinds of things, we must do it with people at the center. There must be like a participatory approach to this. And yeah, I bring my own life experience to this. I am, you can either call it first generation or second generation. So my parents came over to the UK. I was born here in London in a low socioeconomic background. We had free school meals. We were in the service quite a lot. And I have that experience of the service. And so that's what I bring to this research. And that's what I've brought to a lot of my career. And for me, it was a very, very, I guess, an unusual upbringing because I got scholarships to private schools and all sorts of things happened that made me a little bit different from everybody else. And so I come at it with this lived experience. And that also comes with a lot of baggage itself, because there are these power dynamics. And you do see that a lot of people might go into these kinds of careers and they might go into research and they might want to work in these kinds of areas because I want to help somebody. And it really shouldn't be about helping people. That's a bit patronizing. It should be about creating systems where people are able, first of all, where the system is sustainable, where it thrives, where the system is created for the person and with the person, and where the system addresses all of the capabilities as well as the needs of the person. And then second of all, it should be a system which is also sort of owned by the person as well, not a system that things are done to the person. Yeah, I think these sort of power dynamics, these things that we see within all of our institutions, these kind of things are important to how we address these concerns within institutions. I think that in order to create a fairer society, what we need to do is start pulling at these systems, pulling at these institutions that we conform to and that govern us. Like I said before, when we do things like around systemic change, we've got to look at them from a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach. I'm not sure if that answers your question. There's a lot, I could go on for quite a long time, but that's the experience that I bring to this work.
That's really helpful. And that leads on to what I was going to ask next, really, was about, well, what are the hopeful outcomes of the likes of the community COVID project? So as you're saying, it's, identifying that need for creating, I suppose, just to very much reduce what you've said there, creating these sustainable, enabling shared systems that are beneficial really across the board. And as you say, it's not that patronizing, oh, we'll do this to help you, but it's actually empowering people to take on their own issues and do more for themselves and to stop preventing them from doing that. So from the project, it's gathering information, but then what's that going to be used for? Is that going to be used to lobby with evidence for these changes? It's the hope that it will help change mindsets, even in ordinary people. So as you say, that the top down, so maybe from a government level, but also then from the bottom up, to think, well, if there are people in socioeconomically deprived backgrounds who just think art is a load of nonsense and it's a waste of their time and only you select derogatory terms here and it's only for those people that they think that they should look down on, is it to change their minds and perspectives and go, no, actually, you're very welcome to do all of this. We're reducing the barriers, we're pulling those away now. We want you to join in if you want to join it, that sort of stuff. So I'm rambling a bit, but are those the sorts of things that the aim is to?
Yeah, I mean, definitely having a participatory approach, definitely having the person who's using the service at the center of the service and sort of driving the change within the service. That's something that we always talk about, and that's something that we always promote. We believe that we should have the user at the center of the service, have this participatory approach. To involve the user within our research is also, a very, very important thing. what we're looking at, I guess you're talking about the deliverables of the project. We are looking at a lot of, I guess you can call them top-down outputs. So we're writing a rapid evidence review, where we're looking at a critical appraisal of all of the community activities that have gone on in the last year or so. We're writing an evaluation framework. We're writing a good practice assessment that makes recommendations for people who are running community projects. We're looking at writing an evidence synthesis report, and then doing lots and lots of peer-reviewed publications and conference presentations. And then at the same time, like I was talking about, the creative journeys that we're looking at from the participants from the workshops that we've done. So we're looking at how people have experienced COVID, and how they've experienced the pandemic, and how they're expressing their experience of the pandemic. So we're looking at all of these things, and I guess you can call them, all of these things, a top-down thing that we're looking at. But the bottom-up thing that we're doing is promoting participatory action within our research, promoting the voice of the user within our research, and having lots and lots of elements of that voice within all of the top-down things that we're doing. So within the reports that we're writing, we want to have the voice of the user within the reports. Within the conferences that we're doing, we want to have pictures and, the creative journeys. We want to have all of those within the presentations that we're doing. And that's because we want to emphasize that this is research that is done on behalf of a group of people. And it is important to have that group of people, if they could be part of the research, if they could be part of, if they could be the researchers, that is perfect. But if that's not possible, then their voice needs to be heard within all of the elements of the research.
It feels like COVID has brought about the opportunity, or the very rapid need and necessity to really properly assess all of this, because these were problems that were existing anyway. It's one of those things where I think across the board, it didn't bring the problems with it. It highlighted them, it showed them up. It made them undeniable. So is that part of it as well? It's not just about responding to COVID. This is forever. We need this change because this is going to happen again at some point, or there's going to be some other kind of public health crisis.
Yeah, and I think what COVID has done is really highlighted the inequalities that we have in society as it is. And it's really, really kind of exacerbated them as well. So first of all, when we say vulnerabilities, when we say that we're working with vulnerable people, what we're actually saying is that we're working with people who are in socioeconomic vulnerability. We are working with people who have physiological vulnerabilities, so long-term health conditions, and also with people with psychological vulnerabilities, so people with, long-term mental health conditions. And when we look at how the pandemic has affected people within these groups, what we see is that these vulnerable populations entered the pandemic from very, very uneven starting points. If you're living in poverty, for example, if you're on a low wage, if you're a member of a single parent household, you're most likely to have the highest level of COVID-related impact. You're more likely to be exposed to the virus. You're more likely to be living in very condensed areas. And, these kind of disparities put vulnerable people at more of a risk of negative outcomes. And those negative outcomes are only there because there's already existing structural and institutional disadvantage. And the same is for people with chronic physiological conditions, chronic psychological conditions that require multiple points of entry into various social care and health services. And so what we know is that if you started off the pandemic from an uneven starting point, then those uneven starting points are just going to get more and more and more disparate. That's the landscape that we've started off with. And you're right that the pandemic has highlighted vulnerabilities. And what we're also wary of is that, do these vulnerabilities, are they going to carry on post-pandemic? Are the services that we're promoting during the pandemic going to be running the same way as they are in 2 or 3 years' time? Have we created different ways of working during the pandemic that we will now be expected to work over the next, several years? And those are things, we can't answer those things at the moment. What we do know is that there's been a severe sort of upheaval to lots and lots of community activities and community organizations over the last year or so. What we don't know is how those community organizations organisations are going to adapt and survive in the future in order to address all of the vulnerabilities that they have been doing for years and years. And so, for the people that are working within those activities, within those organisations, there is a big worry that we're working on shoestring budgets. We're completely stretched. We're doing things online when there's a lot of digital poverty, when there's a lot of deprivation and people don't have access to online things. And so how is this going to carry on? Are we now going to be expected to work on these shoestring budgets from now on? There are lots and lots of questions about how, social health and community care services are going to work from now on. And it is a bit of a worry for people that are working on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot to think about there. Do you know if there's anything what could be possible solutions, or what will assist people in what we need to do to start affecting change? Do we need to start writing to our MPs? I guess, if you could point people to where we can start learning more about your research, that would probably be a good start as well. But, is there anything that general listeners of this podcast, what can they do to maybe push this on a little bit more? Is there anything we can do, and what might that be? What do you need to get this started?
Yeah, so you can find out more about our research at culturehealthresearch.wordpress.com. That just outlines quite a lot of the projects that we've been working on. Culture Health Research Group at UCL, we focus on lots of different types of community participation activities and how they influence our well-being and our health. That's a very interesting question. What can we do to help? It's a very, very interesting question. I think the first thing that we can do is promote community activities, promote these kinds of organisations, and help these kinds of organisations that are working on the ground and working with people. We should be promoting better funding to these kinds of organisations. These kinds of things are out of our hands, but you're saying to writing letters to MPs. You could do these kinds of things. You could be actively involved in these kinds of debates and stuff. But I think the best that we can possibly do is create a system which promotes community engagement, that promotes healthy participation and public services that involve the user at the centre of the service. And I think when we can create a system where these things can exist, then we can kind of start to address these inequalities in society. When we can look at how power dynamics within the system can be addressed, when it's less of an us versus them kind of a system, when it's less of you need to do this and this and this and this in order to get your universal credit, this kind of system, when it's less of you need to jump through these hoops before we can sign you on. When there's less of this kind of a power dynamic, that's when you might get better participation within systems, within these public institutions. So I guess what I'm saying is that we need a systemic change, and we need a much more compassionate way of running things in the public services. I don't know if we can do that from writing to our MPs, but the bigger picture, I guess, would be that.
Yeah, I think, it's a small advocacy thing to do, but it doesn't hurt to educate your MP. Some of them are willing to be educated on things. I've found that in my constituency, at least. It's worth a try.
It's worth a try, and it's worth promoting these kinds of things. Yeah,
for sure. It's put me in mind, I think, of things I've heard on a raft of other podcasts that I listen to, where sometimes we just need to be leaders in our own communities. And it might be those of us who maybe have that little bit more privilege than somebody else, just starting something. I think that, like, as we've seen with the mutual aid groups that just sprang up more than a year ago, where communities just got together and did stuff for each other, did shopping for each other, just small things like that. It's maybe huge to somebody else, and it's just things that can include your neighbours or whatever. And hopefully, if it's feeling quite tiny, if there's a ripple effect of that tiny droplet that you put in the water, hopefully it would get a bit bigger. And as you say, it is about empowerment rather than charity, you know, and that's a major frustration I have, is that in the UK, certainly, we're so reliant on charities. I mean, me and myself, the only way I've had proper treatment for mental health issues is through charities. That's a really major thing that we as a society need to go, that's not okay. It shouldn't be up to people donating their hard-earned money to pay for somebody else to get therapy. You know, it should be provided for, because we're not well because of the systems.
It's a basic, it's a fundamental right to be able to access any kind of health support. You wouldn't expect, if you have high cholesterol or if you have diabetes, you wouldn't expect to be ignored by the health service because you have this long-term health condition. And it should be no different if you have any other condition. If you're experiencing any kind of health condition, that should be addressed by the health service. And I do feel that we're kind of in the foothills of this, both of this research, but then also of this way of working with people. We see big sort of shortfalls in the social care system, where if you're a carer for somebody, you are having to rely on charity. You're having to rely on things that you shouldn't be having to rely on. The state should be, you know, supporting you within these situations. And in other countries, there is this kind of state support, or there is this emerging addressing of the increase in social care needs. And we do have that here as well. It's happening, but it needs to increase in the next, you know, however many years, because we now have more people who are recognizing mental health conditions. We have more people that are in need of carers. We have more people that are in need of preventative medicine. And these things all can be addressed through holistic interventions, through these salutogenic approaches. And if we can use these things to address these issues, then that would be brilliant. But it does need state support, and it does need, you know, the public service support. And hopefully that's something that can happen in the future.
It's all stuff to work towards. I think on a happier note, you mentioned to me before that there might be an online exhibition of some of the work from the workshops. Would you be able to tell us something about that?
Yeah, so if you go to our website, you should be able to see the exhibition. It should be up in the next few weeks or so. Yeah, so it's culturehealthresearch.wordpress.com.
Wonderful. Rabya, is there anything else that we haven't covered today that you would like to say? This is a good, it can be about anything. If you just want to, anything that we haven't got to. I mean, I think we've covered everything we plan to do, but if there's anything at all I've forgotten about, or do you're burning to say, or what's your favorite movie, you know, anything at all, anything, you've got the floor.
I don't know if you're going to regret doing that. I think it is important to reiterate that these kind of different innovative and alternative ways of looking at health, these different ways of working can really work. And, you know, we like to promote those things, and we like to look at different ways of working. We like to look at innovation and how public services might be able to work in a completely different way. If we just turn the service on its head, how might it work? I worked in an innovation project years and years ago where we tried to look at how to innovate the job centre. A simple thing that we did was allow the people who are signing on to sit in the chairs of the person working at the job centre. And changing that power dynamic, you could see that it did something for people's confidence. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at public services. It's a very telling way of how we do public services. And I think there is a lot to be said about this power dynamic that's in research and in public services, in all of these kinds of things that we're looking at. And, you know, if we can kind of change that a little bit, if we can change the hierarchy around a little bit, make it a little bit less us versus them, then maybe we might be able to move forward.
That's wonderful. It's a really important message. Dr. Rabya Mughal, thank you so much for all your time and for conducting this really important research. It's been just an absolute pleasure getting to know you and about your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting to talk to you. Thank you.
This is a Cozy Peapod production with me, Paula Blair. The music is Common Ground by Airtone, used under a 3.0 non-commercial Creative Commons license and is available at ccmixer.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a good rating, subscribe and recommend Audiovisual Cultures to a friend. All of our contact details, socials, information, ways to listen and our mailing list sign up can be found on our website, linked in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening and supporting. Take care and I'll catch you next time.